Let me tell you something nobody believed when I first said it out loud. Not my crew, not my commanding officer, not even the medical team who pulled me out of that settlement afterward, wrapped in a thermal blanket with my hands still shaking. They looked at me the way you look at someone who's had too much recycled oxygen on a long haul. That polite, careful expression people make when they think you've gone somewhere in your head that you're not coming back from. But I was there. I saw what happened. And I have spent 3 years now trying to find the right words to describe a moment that lasted maybe 11 seconds, but somehow rearranged every single thing I thought I understood about what it means to be human. A Vorkai hunting unit, 7 feet of bioengineered predator, scarred from 6 campaigns across 4-star systems, stopped cold in the middle of a hunt, pulled back its claws, went silent, and walked away because a girl smiled at it. That's the story. That's all of it, except it's not even close to all of it because the smile was the end. And you need to understand everything that came before the smile to understand why it mattered so much. So sit down, let me start from the beginning. The setup. The Kerrigan Drift is not the kind of place people choose to live. It's the kind of place people end up. You know the difference. Choosing means options. Ending up means you ran out of them somewhere else, and the drift was what was left. A sprawling, half-pressurized settlement carved into the rock shelf of a moon that nobody bothered to name properly, just catalogued under the registry number KD7, and more or less forgotten by the kind of people who sit in council chambers on Alara Prime and make decisions about which populations matter. The population of the drift was somewhere around 40,000 at the time this happened. 40,000 people jammed into a settlement that was originally rated for 12. You had original colonists whose families had been there 3 generations, miners mostly, and the merchants and medics and mechanics who followed the mines. Then you had refugees from the Sural Expanse after the Covenant Wars chewed through that sector and spat out the survivors. Then you had people like me, contractors, logistics runners, people passing through on short-term work, who somehow never quite left because the drift had a way of doing that to you. The architecture was a mess of eras and urgency. The original settlement was standard prefab modular, the kind of gray, boxy construction that goes up fast and lasts just long enough that nobody bothers to replace it. But the expansions were layered on top of that over 40 years of need and improvisation. So you had corridors that went up at angles no structural engineer would sanction, airlocks that had been repurposed into storefronts, living quarters that had started as cargo containers and been modified with windows and insulation, and whatever the inhabitants could scavenge. The whole place smelled like recycled air, machine oil, cooked protein, and something underneath all of that, something old and faintly metallic, that I always thought was just the moon itself, the rock breathing through the settlement's bones. The gravity was about 0.7 standard. Enough that you adjusted quickly but never quite forgot. You moved slightly too easy. Things fell slightly too slow. And after a while, your body started to recalibrate in ways that made full-G environments uncomfortable when you returned to them. It was 3 months into my contract when the Vorkai showed up. I was running supply logistics for a distribution node in Sector 9, the deepest-in residential section of the drift, and my job mostly involved moving crates, managing inventory discrepancies, and occasionally mediating between contractors and the drift's internal governance council. A loose, fractious body that spent most of its energy arguing about rationing allocations, and not enough energy on things like, say, defense infrastructure. That last oversight was about to become very relevant. The Vorkai, if you don't know them, and a lot of people outside the border sectors don't, are not the enemy exactly. That's the complicated part. They're a species that evolved as apex predators on a high-gravity, high-radiation world, built for hunting in ways that go down to the cellular level. The hegemony, the political entity they operate under, had signed the Turalian Accords along with most of the major powers. On paper, they were allies, or at least not enemies. But the Vorkai have something in their culture, I want to say tradition, but it runs deeper than that, more like compulsion, called the Keltorath. The hunt that proves. It's a rite of passage, a status marker, a spiritual practice all rolled into one. Young Vorkai, military track Vorkai especially, are expected to complete a Keltorath hunt in territory that isn't their own. The point is to demonstrate that you can take prey in an unfamiliar environment, that your instincts and your training are strong enough to overcome the disadvantage of foreign ground. The Accords had provisions about this. There were supposed to be designated zones, uninhabited regions, controlled environments where the hunts could happen without affecting protected populations. And for most of the big, well-documented settlements, those provisions were enforced. The Kerrigan Drift was not well documented. And the people in those council chambers on Alara Prime who made decisions about which populations matter had apparently not gotten around to formally registering the drift under the protected settlement protocols. So when a Vorkai hunting party of 6 came through the edge of the moon's territorial marker, they were, technically, operating in an unregistered gray zone. They weren't supposed to be hunting humans, officially. But the Keltorath doesn't make clean distinctions about officially. I heard about the first incident before I saw anything myself. A maintenance worker named Greg, a big, quiet man who ran atmospheric processing in Sector 4, came into the distribution node on a Tuesday morning looking like he'd seen something that had peeled a layer off of him. He sat down in the break area, poured himself a cup of something that passed for coffee in the drift, and stared at the table for a while before anyone asked him what was wrong. He said he'd been running a routine check on the outer atmospheric vents, the ones that service the rock shelf perimeter, and he'd seen something moving in the dark outside the settlement boundary. Not moving the way a maintenance drone moves, or the way the automated ore processors move. Moving the way a living thing moves when it doesn't want to be seen. Big, he said. Real big, 7 feet maybe more, moving low, flat against the rock, and it was watching the vent access points. People nodded and made the kinds of noises that people make. Someone said it was probably a scout drone. There were always military assets in this sector, half the time unregistered. Someone else said maybe a rogue cargo bot. They'd had problems with a batch of rogue cargo bots in Sector 6 2 years ago. Greg listened to all of it and didn't argue and finished his coffee and went back to work. But that night, at the sector checkpoint between 4 and 5, a guard named Pella went missing. Not went home early, not took a different route, disappeared. Shift change came and she wasn't there. Her scanner was found on the floor of the checkpoint corridor, and the readings on it showed something interesting, an energy signature that the drift's databases couldn't match to any registered species or vessel type in the system. The Governance Council had a meeting. I wasn't invited, but I heard about it afterward. The decision they came to was that they didn't have enough information to confirm a threat, and that confirming a threat publicly would create panic, and that panic in a pressurized settlement was itself a serious danger. So they kept it quiet, which meant that for the next 5 days, while the Vorkai hunting party moved through the edges of the drift, learning the corridors, mapping the access points, identifying which sections were most isolated and least monitored, 40,000 people went about their lives without knowing. I want to tell you about the drift at night because it matters. The settlement didn't have a natural day-night cycle. It was a moon, and the light came from the gas giant it orbited, which meant illumination was a function of orbital position and was deeply irregular. What the drift had instead was a programmed cycle. The main corridor lighting dimmed to about 30% at what the settlement called 2200 hours, and the residential sections went to 20. It was never fully dark. The operational lighting never went off completely, Because in a pressurized environment, you need people to be able to navigate in an emergency. But at night, the drift was quiet in a specific way, a heavy way. The atmospheric processors hummed at a different frequency in the lower population hours. The corridor sounds changed, foot traffic, vendor noise, the ambient chatter of 40,000 people going about their business, all quieted down to something that was almost peaceful if you didn't think too hard about the rock overhead and the vacuum outside. I liked the nights in the drift, honestly. I'd walk sometimes after my shift just through the corridors, getting the kind of alone time you can't find during the day in a place that packed. There's a particular quality to a settlement at night. The way the lights catch the metal walls, the way your footsteps sound different in empty corridors, the way you can hear the hum of the life support systems and feel, in some strange way, how much work is going into keeping you alive. It was on one of those night walks, 4 days after Pella disappeared, that I first saw one of them. I was in Sector 7, coming back from the outer maintenance ring where I'd been doing a late inventory check. Sector 7 was one of the older residential sections. The corridors were narrower there, the ceiling lower, the lighting a little more yellowed from years of oxidation on the lamp housings. The kind of section that feels like a lived-in place rather than a functional space. I was walking, not thinking about much, and I passed one of the side corridors, a maintenance access passage that ran perpendicular to the main residential corridor, about 6 feet wide, lined with pipes and cable housings. I glanced down it out of habit. You do that in the drift just scanning. It becomes automatic. At the far end of the access passage, where it turned into a junction, there was a shape. It was dark, the maintenance passages ran at about 15% lighting, and my brain tried to categorize it in the first fraction of a second the way brains do, cycling through options. Large equipment, a shadow from a jutting pipe, a maintenance bot with an unusual profile. None of those fit. Because the shape moved. Not fast, not with any urgency. It shifted, a slow, deliberate, almost liquid repositioning of something very large, and for just a moment before it disappeared around the junction corner, I saw the outline clearly enough to understand what I was looking at. 7 feet, maybe more. Broad across the shoulders in a way that wasn't human architecture. The mass distributed differently, the torso deeper, the limbs jointed in ways that implied a different skeletal structure. The color was dark, nearly the same tone as the corridor shadows, which I realized wasn't coincidence of bioadaptive pigmentation. I would learn later, a natural ability of Vorkai biology that let them modulate surface coloration based on ambient light. It was looking at me. Even in that darkness, I could see the eyes, 2 points of faint amber luminescence, the light-gathering organs that let Vorkai operate in near-zero visibility conditions. It looked at me for exactly as long as it wanted to look at me. Then it moved around the corner and was gone. I stood in the main corridor for a while after that, not moving, just processing. Then I went and found the sector coordinator and told her what I'd seen. And unlike what had happened with Greg's report, she believed me maybe because she'd gotten 3 other reports in the previous 2 days that she'd been quietly sitting on, and she sent a security ping to the Governance Council. The response came back within 2 hours. Shelter-in-place protocols activated for sectors 6 through 9. Settlement-wide alert status elevated to amber. Requests submitted to the nearest hegemony diplomatic relay for confirmation of any authorized Kel-Toreth activity in the KD7 zone. The response to that diplomatic relay would not come for 11 days. The Vorkai hunting party was not planning to wait 11 days. Build tension. The thing about being hunted in an enclosed space is that the environment works both ways. The settlement's corridors and chambers were a maze to the Vorkai, unfamiliar, variable, full of the strange acoustics and atmospheric inconsistencies of 40 years of improvised construction. But they were also a constraint on us. No open ground to run across. No terrain to use. Just corridors and chambers and airlocks, and a population that couldn't go outside because outside was vacuum and rock. The shelter-in-place protocol meant that civilians were supposed to stay in their residential sections. Essential workers, atmospheric processors, medical, power generation, continued on restricted routes with armed escort. The Drift's security force was small for a population this size. About 200 personnel, lightly armed, trained primarily for internal order maintenance rather than combat. Against 6 Vorkai hunting units in Kel-Toreth mode. That's not a good ratio. I need to explain what a Vorkai in Kel-Toreth mode actually is, because the word hunting doesn't fully capture it. The Kel-Toreth is a ritualized state. Vorkai entering it undergo a physical change pheromonal cascade that affects aggression thresholds, pain sensitivity, reaction time. They become something more than their baseline already impressive biology. Reaction times measured at half a human baseline. Strength that puts them through standard interior bulkheads. And the hunting intelligence, the part that maps terrain, identifies weaknesses, patterns behavior, operating at what specialists describe as a kind of cold, patient genius. 6 of them in our settlement, and we had nowhere to go. The first confirmed engagement happened in Sector 5. A security patrol, 4 officers, encountered 2 Vorkai in the corridor outside a residential block. The encounter lasted approximately 90 seconds. 2 officers were injured, 1 critically. No Vorkai casualties. The patrol managed to trigger a corridor lockdown that bought time, but the Vorkai simply bypassed it through a maintenance access route that the security maps hadn't flagged. The second engagement was in Sector 8, 12 hours later. Different result. Security had managed to set up a channeling position, using the Drift's structural layout to force the Vorkai into a narrower approach. They got one of the 6 with a sustained discharge from 2 industrial plasma cutters that maintenance had repurposed. Got 1. The remaining 5 regrouped. And then they changed tactics. They stopped engaging security, started moving around security, deeper into residential sections, towards civilian population. That's when people understood that the Kel-Toreth hunt wasn't about defeating us. It wasn't a military operation. It wasn't about taking ground or resources or making a political point. It was about proving something to themselves. About taking prey. Any prey. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 40,000 people in a pressurized settlement on a forgotten moon, and 6 of the most efficient hunters in known space moving through the corridors playing a patient game. And the thing that made it most terrifying was that it wasn't malicious. It wasn't hatred. The Vorkai didn't hate us. They just didn't find us impressive enough to be afraid of. I ended up in Sector 9's community shelter on the second day of the elevated alert. The shelter was originally designed as an emergency mustering point, a large, reinforced chamber near the settlement's core, with its own atmospheric reserve and independent power supply. It held maybe 2,000 people comfortably. We had closer to 4,000 in it. People had brought what they could carry, food packets, personal items, children. The sound in there was the sound of barely contained fear doing its best to sound normal. People talking too loud or too quiet. Children who were old enough to understand that something was wrong but not old enough to understand what. Elderly residents sitting very still, the way people who have survived a lot of things sit when another thing arrives. I was helping organize food distribution, something to do, something useful, a way to not just stand there and think about what was in the corridors when I first saw her. She was sitting against the far wall of the shelter, in a section where a group of families had clustered together. Mid-30s maybe, it was hard to tell precisely. Dark hair pulled back practically. The kind of face that isn't immediately remarkable but that you keep noticing because there's something in it that doesn't change even when everything around it is changing. She was reading something on a data slate. just reading, like she'd found a pocket of quiet inside herself that the noise and fear of the shelter couldn't reach. Next to her, close enough that they were touching at the shoulder, was a girl. Maybe 12, maybe younger. She was small for whatever age she was. She had the same dark hair, wearing it loose, and she was asleep on the woman's shoulder. Not pretending to sleep, not that restless half-doze of people who are too scared to really go under. Actually deeply asleep, with the absolute trust of a child who feels completely safe. In a shelter with 4,000 scared people in it, that kid was genuinely sleeping. I thought it was the mother who made that possible, something about the woman's stillness, her particular quality of calm. I thought, whatever that woman has, it's contagious, at least for people who are right next to her. I found out later that the girl's name was Sable. The woman, her older sister, not her mother, was named Voss, Mara Voss, former xenobiologist, currently working as a naturalist consultant for the Drift's agricultural expansion program, which was a fancy way of saying she studied how things grew in low light, low gravity, artificial soil conditions, and told the farming sections which approaches actually worked. Mara had spent 4 years before coming to the Drift doing field research in environments that were, by any reasonable measure, significantly more dangerous than a settled moon. She'd been in the Sural Expanse during a period when it was technically contested territory. She'd done documented field work within 300 meters of crave nesting sites, the crave being a species that made most people's shortlist for things I would least like to meet in person. She was not, I would learn, easily frightened. Which is relevant, very relevant, because what was about to happen to her would have broken most people before the critical moment even arrived. The breach happened on the 3rd day. I don't know exactly how they got through the shelter's outer door. The official report afterwards said the Vorkai had identified a ventilation access point that connected to the shelter's atmospheric reserve and worked through it. Whatever the method, the result was that, at approximately 3:40 hours settlement time, the shelter's emergency alert system triggered. Not the settlement-wide alert, the shelter-specific one, the one that meant the threat was inside. 4,000 people went from asleep or barely conscious to fully awake and terrified in about 12 seconds. The lights stayed on emergency protocol, but they shifted to red spectrum emergency illumination, which does something very specific to a room full of frightened people. Red light on scared faces. The sounds that came out of that shelter in those first moments were, I don't have better words for this, they were the sounds of mammals understanding they were in a trap. 2 Vorkai had come through the ventilation access, 2 of the 5 remaining. They didn't rush the crowd, they didn't need to. They moved to opposite sides of the shelter, and they stood there and they looked. 7 feet tall, bioadaptive coloring shifting slowly in the red emergency light, going through shades of deep crimson and shadow dark as they adjusted. Eyes catching the light and reflecting it, that amber glow, in a way that made them look like something from the very bottom of an evolutionary fear response. The crowd, 4,000 people, pressed to the center of the shelter, the physics of fear. Everyone moving away from both walls simultaneously, the center of the room becoming a mass of bodies, people falling, people being pushed, children being lifted by whoever was closest. I was near the food distribution table. I had nowhere useful to go. I watched. And then I saw something happen that I have thought about every day since. Mara Voss didn't move to the center. Climax. She was still against the far wall, still sitting. Sable had woken up with everyone else. You couldn't not wake up. The alarm was designed to be impossible to sleep through, and was now sitting upright, very close to Mara, and looking at the 2 Vorkai with an expression that I was too far away to read clearly, but that I could see was not quite pure terror. The Vorkai on the far side of the shelter, the one closer to Mara and Sable, began to move. Not the rushed movement of something that has found prey and is closing. The deliberate, measured movement of a hunter that has identified a target and is taking its time because it can. It moved past the mass of people crowded in the center, past families clinging together, past security officers who had raised their weapons and were doing the math on their ammunition and their angle and the civilians in the crossfire, and coming up with numbers that didn't add up to anything good. Past all of it. It was moving toward the wall where Mara sat. Because Mara was separate from the crowd, because Mara had not run. Because in the logic of a Vorkai in Kel-Torath, the logic of a predator that has been hunting prey for its entire evolutionary history, the thing that separates itself from the herd is either sick or stupid or dangerous, and sick and stupid were more likely than dangerous. It was going to take her first. I started moving. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Something. People make decisions in those moments that aren't really decisions. They're responses, reflexes, the body going somewhere before the mind has finished the calculation. I got maybe 8 steps before the Vorkai stopped. It stopped because of Sable. The girl, 12 years old, or maybe younger, small for whatever age she was, had stood up. Not backed away, not tried to hide behind Mara. Stood up facing the Vorkai, and she was looking at it. The Vorkai was maybe 20 feet away, 19 feet, 18. Sable stood there and she looked at it. And then, and this is the part that I have told people and had people not believe, the part that made the medical team look at me with that careful, polite expression, she smiled. Not a desperate smile, not a frightened showing of teeth, not the social reflex that humans sometimes do when they're cornered and trying to appease, not any of that. She smiled the way a child smiles when something interesting has appeared. Curious, open, genuine. Like she was meeting something fascinating and had absolutely no reason to be afraid of it. The Vorkai stopped walking. It was now maybe 15 feet from her. 15 feet from a 12-year-old girl in a red-lit emergency shelter on a forgotten moon, in the middle of a sanctioned hunt, with 4,000 terrified people behind it, and a meal it had correctly identified right in front of it. And it stopped. I watched it. I watched it in a way that I've replayed frame by frame in memory for 3 years trying to understand. The Vorkai's bioadaptive coloring went through something strange. There was a ripple in it, not the smooth adjustment it made when processing light levels, but something that started in the chest region and moved outward, almost like a flinch. The amber eyes, which had been fixed and purposeful, shifted, just slightly. The quality of the attention changed. The creature leaned forward, not the predatory forward lean of something closing distance, but the forward lean of something looking more carefully at something it hadn't expected to see. Mara had not moved. She was still sitting. She had put her arm around Sable, not to pull her back, just placing it there, present, and she was watching the Vorkai with the same quality of attention she'd been directing at her data slate. Alert, curious, not afraid. The Vorkai looked at Sable for what felt like much longer than it actually was. Maybe 11 seconds, maybe 12. Then it looked at Mara. Then it looked at Sable again. And then it made a sound. Low, from somewhere deep in the chest cavity. Not a growl, or not only a growl. There was something in it that the translation matrices I've consulted since have categorized as hesitation vocalization. The sound a Vorkai makes when the situation has presented a variable that the current behavioral program didn't account for. It took one step back. Then another. And then it turned slowly with the specific deliberateness of a creature that is not fleeing but choosing, and it walked back across the shelter floor, past the crowd, past the security officers, to the ventilation access it had come through. The second Vorkai on the other side of the shelter watched this happen. Then it, too, turned and left. The shelter was silent for a moment that seemed to last longer than physics allows. Then 4,000 people started making noise all at once. I made my way to Mara and Sable through the chaos of the aftermath. Security personnel were moving through the crowd. The governance council rep was on the shelter intercom giving instructions nobody could hear over the noise. Medics were moving toward people who'd been hurt in the crowd surge. Sable was sitting back down against the wall, leaning into Mara's side. She looked fine, calm. There was color in her face and her eyes were bright, and she was watching the shelter bustle around her with the same quality of interested attention she'd directed at the Vorkai. Mara looked up when I reached them. I didn't know what to say. I said something stupid. I think it was something like, "Are you both okay?" And she nodded once, in a way that conveyed not just yes but also I know you want to ask something else. I said, "What is she? What just happened?" Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's my sister, and she's never been afraid of anything she didn't understand." I waited. Mara continued quieter. "We grew up in an agricultural station, very remote, very isolated. Sable was 3 when a Veth nest established itself in the station's foundation. You know what Veth are?" I said I did. Veth were not small. Veth were not friendly. Veth had driven a full hegemony military survey team off a charted planet 2 decades ago, and the planet was still listed as a no-approach zone. She used to leave food for them, Mara said. The Veth, at the edge of the station perimeter, they accepted it. They never bothered anyone in the station. She was 6 years old. She looked at Sable, who had closed her eyes again, apparently deciding that the crisis was resolved and she could go back to sleep. "She doesn't have a fear response," Mara said, then corrected herself. "That's not right, she has one. It just doesn't engage when she's curious. And she's almost always curious." I looked at the ventilation access where the Vorkai had gone. I said, that's not what stopped it. That's not the whole reason." Mara met my eyes. "No," she said, "it isn't." She paused. "Vorkai Keltoreth hunting instinct is prey-response triggered. The trigger is fear. More specifically, the pheromonal signature of fear. They can smell it at 12 to 15 meters range. It's the start condition for the full hunt engagement. Without it, the behavioral cascade doesn't complete." I thought about what she'd said. She wasn't afraid, so the trigger wasn't there. "The trigger wasn't there for either of us," Mara said, and I realized she was right. Neither she nor Sable had been afraid, not in the way the Vorkai's biological systems were calibrated to read. But the signal it did get, the signal from Sable, that was something else entirely. Something its evolutionary history didn't have a category for. "What signal?" Mara looked at her sister for a moment. "Curiosity," she said. "Pure, genuine curiosity. No threat, no fear, no submission. Just interest. An entity encountering it and finding it interesting." She paused. "A predator's instinct is built on knowing what prey looks like, what it acts like, what it does when the hunter appears. That's the entire foundation of the hunt. Take away the prey response and you take away the trigger, but replace it with something the predator has genuinely never encountered in a prey species, something outside the entire behavioral vocabulary it was born knowing." She nodded slowly, working through her own thoughts. "That doesn't just break the pattern, it breaks the system, because the system has no output for that. It's not prey. It's not a predator. It's not something threatening. It's just a thing that shouldn't exist according to everything the Vorkai's entire evolutionary history told it was true." "And it walked away," I said. "It walked away," she agreed, "because walking away was the only thing left when everything else stopped making sense." Resolution. The remaining Vorkai hunting party left the settlement within 4 hours. Not evicted, left. There was a distinction, and the hegemony diplomatic team that arrived 2 days later made a point of noting it in their formal report. The hunting party had withdrawn voluntarily, which was a Keltoreth distinction that carried its own cultural weight. A Vorkai who withdraws from a hunt is not disgraced. There's a category for it, a hunt that presents conditions that cannot be resolved by hunting, and it carries its own status, different from completion but not without meaning. The diplomatic team's report was 1,400 pages. I've read the relevant sections. There's a passage in the Xenosociological Analysis that discusses the KD-7 shelter incident that describes what Sable did as an unprecedented stimulus response inversion in Kel-Toreth engagement protocol, and goes on for 3 pages of behavioral theory. I prefer Mara's version. The formal outcome. The Kerrigan drift was retroactively registered under protected settlement protocols, which should have happened 40 years ago. The Governance Council got the dressing down they deserved from the Ilara Prime Council, which was a mild satisfaction. The diplomatic team arranged for the hegemony to contribute to reconstruction of the shelter's ventilation access systems, which the drift's maintenance crew accepted without comment. Pella, the security officer who disappeared in the first night, she was found in a maintenance junction in Sector 4, injured but alive. The Vorkai hunting party had taken her off the field, which was also a Kel-Toreth distinction. Quarry that had been determined to be too small or too limited to merit the hunt was to be preserved, not wasted. She was 3 days in medical and then back on duty. She never went back to checkpoint work in Sector 7. Nobody blamed her. The drift went back to being the drift. The 40,000 people who'd been packed into shelters and residential quarters went back to their corridors and their work and their lives, and within a week, the settlement had settled back into its particular rhythm. The hum of processors, the smell of recycled air and machine oil and cooked protein, the sound of 40,000 people doing what people do. I finished my contract. I could have left when it ended. I didn't. I want to tell you about one more thing, because it's the image that stays with me most. 2 weeks after the incident, I was in Sector 7 on a morning walk. The lights were back to their normal gold-white, the foot traffic was building, the vendors were setting up. I passed the community education room, a repurposed cargo bay where the settlement ran classes for the kids whose families had been in the drift long enough that they'd never attended a proper school anywhere. Through the open door, I could see a xenobiology class in progress. A young teacher, an old wall screen, a dozen kids in various states of attention. Sable was in the front row. She had a small sketchbook in front of her and she was drawing something. I slowed down enough to see what it was. She'd drawn a Vorkai, in detail, not the way you draw something frightening, not a monster shape, not teeth first, not the shadow and amberized image that had been in my nightmares. She'd drawn one the way you draw something you find beautiful, the structure of it, the proportions, the way the musculature would move. She'd drawn it with the attention you give to something you genuinely want to understand. She looked up and saw me in the doorway. She gave me the same smile, the real one. And I thought, that's it, that's the whole thing right there. It wasn't that she wasn't afraid because she was brave. Brave implies overcoming fear. There was nothing to overcome. She looked at something that the rest of us, that 40,000 people in 6 hunting mode Vorkai and all the evolutionary history that built both species, looked at through the lens of threat and prey and survival. And she looked at it and thought, interesting. That's what made the predator stop. Not strength, not weapons, not the absence of fear. The presence of wonder. Ending line part 1. They say the greatest distance in the known universe isn't measured in light years. It's the gap between the way a predator sees its prey and the way a child sees the world. Sable closed that gap in 11 seconds. With a smile. Part 2. Document format, narration script. Channel HFY Sci-Fi narration. Continuation, Part 2. Word target, 70008,000 words. Perspective, first-person witness/expanding third-person. Tone, cinematic, reflective building to final resolution. The deeper story. 3 years. That's how long it took before I finally understood what I'd actually witnessed in that shelter. I thought I understood it at the time. I thought Mara had explained it, the prey-response trigger, the pheromonal signature, the behavioral cascade that doesn't complete without the start condition. I thought the explanation was clean and biological, and that I had wrapped the whole thing in the right kind of comprehension. I was wrong, not about the facts. The facts were correct. I was wrong about the meaning. The meaning took 3 years and a trip to the Hegemony Research Corridor on Vel Tassin, and a conversation with the oldest Vorkai I have ever met or hope to ever meet, and it came out the other side as something I did not expect at all. But I need to tell you what happened in between, because the in-between is part of the story too, maybe the most important part, and nobody tells the in-between parts. 6 months after the KD-7 incident, I got a message from a researcher at the Xenobehavioral Studies Institute on Alara Prime. Her name was Dr. Colin Hoare, and she had apparently obtained my name from the Hegemony diplomatic team's debrief files. They'd interviewed everyone who'd been in the shelter, and my account was apparently detailed enough that it had flagged in her research algorithms. She was writing a paper on Kel-Toreth behavioral interrupts, cases where a hunt had been called off voluntarily by the hunting party. It was, she explained in her message, an extremely small dataset. In the entire documented history of Kel-Toreth practice, which went back about 700 years of Vorkai records, there were fewer than 20 confirmed cases of voluntary hunt withdrawal. The KD-7 incident was the only one involving a human stimulus. She wanted to talk. I agreed. We did a long-form transmission interview that lasted about 4 hours, with the usual delays for the distance involved. I told her everything I've told you. She was quiet for a while after I finished, which was the kind of quiet that meant she was processing rather than done. Then she said, "The part about the smile, I need to ask you about that." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "How certain are you that the smile was genuine? Not a trained response, not a social behavior, not an attempt at appeasement. Genuine curiosity." I thought about it. I thought about Sable's face in that red emergency light, the way she'd looked at that Vorkai. The way she still looked at everything, with that open, receptive attention that didn't have a filter in front of it. I said, "I'm as certain as you can be of anything about another person's inner state, which I know isn't a scientific answer." Dr. Hoare said, "It's the right answer, because if it wasn't genuine, it wouldn't have worked." I asked her why. She said, "The Vorkai sensory system is extraordinarily precise when it comes to emotional authenticity. They didn't evolve in a social species environment the way humans did. They don't have the hardware for reading complex social signals the way we do. What they have instead is a direct response system for authenticity. They can detect performed emotion versus genuine emotion with about 93% accuracy at close range. It's connected to their prey response system. Prey sometimes performs calm when it's actually terrified, and a predator that can't tell the difference gets fooled." She paused. What the Vorkai encountered with Sable, it wasn't just the absence of fear. It was the presence of something genuine that wasn't any emotional signal it had a category for in a prey context. Fear, category exists. Aggression, category exists. Submission, category exists. Even the strange calm of an animal that's accepted death, that has a category. She paused again, longer, but genuine, unperformed, non-threatening curiosity directed at a Vorkai during a Kel-Toreth hunt. In 700 years of records, they have no category for that. Because in 700 years of documented Kel-Toreth hunts, it had never happened before. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "So what does that mean for the research, for the bigger picture?" Dr. Hoare was quiet again. Then, "It means the most powerful thing humans have ever done to a Vorkai wasn't military engagement or political negotiation or technological deterrence. It was a 12-year-old girl looking at one with uncomplicated interest." She paused. "I'm not sure what to do with that." I told her I knew exactly how she felt. Mara and I stayed in contact after the incident. Not frequently, she was busy, I was busy. The drift kept everyone busy, but periodically. Occasional messages. Sometimes, when our schedules aligned, lunch in one of the Sector 3 food courts that had decent protein synthesis and decent coffee, which on the drift felt like luxury. She talked about Sable sometimes, about growing up together, the two of them, after their parents died in an atmospheric failure at the agricultural station when Mara was 19 and Sable was 7, about what it had been like to raise a child who was not afraid of things. "It's not always easy," she said once over lunch. "People see it as a problem. Teachers worried about her. Station counselors worried about her. There's a diagnostic term for it. I won't say it because I think the term is wrong, but it gets treated like an absence, like she's missing something. A protective response that she should have." She set down her cup, and I kept thinking, or maybe she has something the rest of us have trained ourselves out of. Maybe the question isn't what's missing, but what she's retained. I asked her what she meant. Mara thought about it. Humans are born curious, completely, fearlessly curious. Watch a 1-year-old encounter something new, they move toward it. That's the default. Fear comes later. It gets layered on by experience and learning, and the entirely reasonable process of learning which things in the world can hurt you. She looked at her cup. Sable learned what things can hurt you. She's not stupid. She's not reckless. She doesn't walk off pressure lock ledges because the ledge is interesting. She just didn't complete the second step, the part where curiosity gets filtered through threat assessment before it becomes an expression. "She just stayed curious," I said. "She just stayed curious," Mara agreed. Then she said something that I've thought about a lot since. The universe is full of things that will kill you based on what you are before you've had a chance to show them anything else. The Vorkai weren't hunting a person in that shelter. They were hunting a category, prey, a signal type, and Sable just didn't broadcast the signal. She was something they had no category for, and you can't hunt a category that doesn't exist. I said, "That sounds almost like a strategy." Mara shook her head. "It can't be a strategy. The moment it becomes a strategy, it becomes performance, and performance they can detect. It only works because she's actually like that." She paused, which is either the most hopeful thing in the world or a quality that belongs to exactly one 12-year-old girl on a forgotten moon and can't be replicated. "Or both," I said. She smiled. "Yeah, or both." The second encounter. I said earlier that it took 3 years and a trip to Veltassin before I fully understood. I need to tell you about that trip. 14 months after the KD-7 incident, the Hegemony Research Initiative on Kel-Toreth Behavioral Psychology formally requested Sable's participation in a study. The diplomatic team had lobbied for it. The KD-7 case had generated significant interest in hegemony academic circles, and there was a genuine scientific question about whether a second exposure would produce the same result, or whether the first encounter had been some kind of one-time anomaly. Mara spent a long time deciding whether to agree. She talked to Sable about it, fully, honestly, in the way she apparently talked to Sable about everything, as though the 13-year-old, she'd had a birthday by this point, was fully capable of making the decision herself, because she was. Sable's answer was apparently immediate and enthusiastic, which surprised nobody who knew her. I was invited along as a witness record participant, because I'd been present at the first incident, and the research team wanted continuity of observation. Veltassin is the research corridor world, an entire planetary installation dedicated to interspecies research, maintained jointly by the Hegemony and the Interspecies Accord Council. It's beautiful, actually. Large, high gravity, covered in dense native vegetation that the installation perches above on a network of elevated platforms and corridors. The sky is a deep indigo during the day. The star is cooler than Sol, and the vegetation below is a shade of deep burgundy green that doesn't look real when you first see it. We arrived and went through the research orientation and met the team, which included Dr. Hoare in person for the first time. She was exactly what I expected, which was small and intense, and the kind of person who listened to everything twice before responding. And we met the Vorkai. His name, the closest phonetic rendering in the common tongue, was something like Vreth, which translated loosely as the one who studies distance. He was old by Vorkai reckoning, 70 cycles, which put him at roughly the human equivalent of late 80s. He walked with a deliberate pace that was both the measured gait of his species, and I thought, the carefully maintained dignity of something very powerful that had learned patience. He was the foremost Vorkai scholar of Keltoreth practice. Had completed 6 hunts in his youth, all on record. Had spent 50 years afterward studying what the Keltoreth meant culturally, philosophically, biologically. Had written what the translation matrix called 12 major works on the subject, though the Vorkai term for what he'd written was more like 12 major arguments. He had read the KD7 report, all of it, in the original hegemony documentation. When we were introduced in the research facility's main meeting chamber, a large, high-ceiling space designed to accommodate Vorkai proportions without making the humans feel like they were visiting a space built for giants, which was a diplomatic balancing act. The facility had clearly spent considerable effort on Vreth looked at Sable for a very long moment. He said something in the Vorkai language. The translation matrix rendered it as, "So you are the one." Sable said, "I'm one of them, there's also Mara." Vreth looked at Mara, then back at Sable. Then he made a sound that took me a moment to identify, partly because I'd never heard it from a Vorkai before, and partly because the translation matrix flagged it as laughter. He sat down, a process that involved some rearrangement of his considerable mass, into a posture that I eventually identified as the Vorkai equivalent of relaxed attention, and said, "Tell me what you saw." He was asking Sable, not the researchers, not Dr. Hoare, not Mara, Sable. Sable thought about it for a moment, actually thought, the way she thought about things, looking somewhere slightly to the side as though the right words were in that direction. Then she said, "I saw something that had decided what I was before it looked at me, and then it looked at me and I wasn't that." Vreth was very still for a moment. He said, "In 700 years, in every record I have studied, I have never heard a human describe it that way." Sable said, "Is that right?" He said, "It is more right than most of what my own scholars have written." The study lasted 4 days. I'm not going to describe all of it. Most of it was controlled observation, measurement sessions, neurological monitoring, the science of it. What I want to tell you about is the conversation that happened on the evening of the 3rd day. Vreth and Sable had, by that point, developed what I can only describe as a rapport. The research team watched it happen with expressions that oscillated between professional fascination and personal bewilderment. The oldest living Vorkai Keltoreth scholar and a 13-year-old girl from a forgotten moon, spending their measurement breaks in conversation that ranged, as far as I could follow it, from the biology of the Vorkai sensory system to the agricultural challenges of growing food on low-gravity moons, to whether a species' concept of beauty was necessarily connected to its concept of prey. On the 3rd evening, I was sitting near enough to hear when Sable asked him directly, "Were you ever in a hunt that went wrong?" Vreth was quiet for a moment, then, "Define wrong." "A hunt where something happened that you didn't expect." Long pause. "Yes," he said, "once." Sable waited. "I was young," he said. "My 2nd hunt. I had entered a forest ecosystem, a world your registry calls Tureth 9, predator-heavy ecosystem. I was in standard Keltoreth engagement, tracking appropriate prey species." He paused. "I encountered a creature that I did not recognize. It was smaller than appropriate prey. It had no clear defensive mechanism I could identify. By every indicator, it should have been a simple acquisition. Sable said, "What happened?" "It sat down," Vrethkalos said, "facing me, and it made a sound." He paused for a long time. The sound was, I have no category for it even now, not alarm, not submission, not any signal I was able to place in my behavioral library. It was something that had no threat component and no fear component, and that I had no response protocol for. Sable said, "So what did you do?" "I sat down also," he said. "We remained like that for some time. Then it went about its business, and so did I." Sable thought about this. "Then, did you ever find out what it was, the creature?" "No," Vrethkalos said. "Tureth-9's biological registry was not complete at the time. It may still not be." Sable said, "I think that's the most interesting thing about what happened to you. You sat down." He looked at her. "Explain." "When something doesn't fit your categories," she said, "you could do a lot of things. You could attack it anyway just to resolve the uncertainty. You could leave and not think about it, but you sat down. That means something about you." He was very still. She continued thoughtfully, "It means that somewhere in you, the curiosity was bigger than the protocol." The room was quiet. Then Vrethkalos said, "In 50 years of scholarship, no human has said that to me." Sable said, "Does it feel right?" He thought for a long time. "Yes," he said. "It feels right." It was on the 4th day, the last day, that Vrethkalos told me the thing that rearranged my understanding of everything. He had asked to speak with me specifically, which surprised me. I was the least remarkable person in that facility, not a researcher, not a xenobiologist, not the remarkable girl or the woman who raised her, just the logistics contractor who had been there. We sat in one of the facility's quieter meeting spaces, smaller room, designed for two-person conversations, the installation's indigo sky visible through a wide window, and he was quiet for a while, organizing what he wanted to say, I thought. Then he said, "You were in the shelter." I said yes. "You saw what the young human did." "Yes." "And you are the one who has been trying to understand it." I said, "For 3 years, yes." He nodded, a Vorkai nod, a different motion than the human one but recognizable in context. "I will tell you something that is not in any public record, something that is in our own internal archives only, and that I am sharing because I believe the Accords intended a level of mutual comprehension that has not yet been achieved." I waited. "The KD-7 hunting party," he said. "I know them. I know their record leader Vrethsala, young, 3 campaigns, exceptional instinct. I spoke with him after the event." I hadn't known that. The hunting party had gone back through hegemony channels, and the diplomatic team had handled it as an institutional matter. I'd never had the details of what they'd reported. "He told me," Vrethkalos said, "that in the moment he encountered the young human, he experienced something he did not have a word for." "What was it?" I asked. "That is what I need to explain," Vrethkalos said. "Because in our language we have a word for every state relevant to the hunt: fear in the prey, aggression in a competitor, the cold focus of the Keltorath, the satisfaction of completion, the specific quality of attention a hunter pays to a landscape. We have precise terms for all of these because for 700 years the Keltorath has required them." He paused. Vrethsala told me that what he felt standing in front of the young human was not any of those things. It was something he had felt only one time before in his life. I said, "When?" "When he was a child," Vrethkalos said, "and he encountered his first Kelvoth, a creature on our homeworld that is essentially sacred in our understanding, not because it is powerful, not because it is dangerous, because it has existed longer than our written history, because it represents something that was here before us." He stopped. "Let me sit with that." He said, Vrethkalos continued, that looking at the young human he felt the same thing he had felt looking at the Kelvoth. Not threat, not prey, something old, something that was here before the categories. I felt something shift. Before the categories, I repeated. Before fear and predator and prey, Vrethkalos said, before all of it, something, he used the word first, something that predates the architecture of the hunt. He looked at me. The young human's curiosity did not register as an unknown signal in a known system. It registered as something that came from before the system existed, and a Vorkai in Kel-Torath cannot hunt something that predates the hunt itself. The room was quiet for a long time. I looked out at the indigo sky over the deep burgundy-green vegetation of Vel-Tassin, and I thought about Sable at the agricultural station at age 6, leaving food at the edge of the perimeter for the Veth. I thought about her in the shelter, standing up, smiling at the largest predator she'd ever encountered. I thought about Mara saying, she just stayed curious. She didn't defeat it, I said. She didn't outsmart it, she didn't find a weakness. No, Vrethkalos agreed. She was herself, I said. The original thing, the thing before the categories. Yes. I sat with that. Is that what humans are? I asked. I mean, is that what we could be? Is that what we actually are underneath everything? Vrethkalos was silent for a long time, the longest pause of that conversation. Then Vrethsala is not a reflective creature. He is a hunter. He does not spend much time in philosophical consideration. But he said one more thing to me when I spoke with him, and it is the thing I most wanted you to know. I waited. He said, I have completed 3 successful hunts. I have respected my prey in all of them. I have been proud of all of them. But I would trade all 3 completions for the chance to sit in that corridor for one more moment, looking at whatever that child was. Vrethkalos held my gaze. A Vorkai in Kel-Torath, he said, who has looked at something that made him want to remain in its presence. In 700 years of records, that has not happened before. The last piece. I went back to the Kerrigan Drift after Vel-Tassin. I know it's a forgotten moon. It smells like recycled air and machine oil and old metal. The architecture is 40 years of improvisation stacked on itself. The lighting is slightly wrong, and the gravity is slightly light, and the coffee is reconstituted protein powder with flavoring added. But it has 40,000 people who went through something together, and it has Mara and Sable. And it has that quality that I have found nowhere else, the quality of a place where things actually happened, where the walls remember, where you can walk down a corridor at night, listening to the processor's hum and feel the weight of what occurred there. I found Sable in the community education room, the same repurposed cargo bay, except she was teaching now, not being taught. She was 14, 15 months after Vel-Tassin, and she was standing at the front of the room with 12 younger kids in front of her, and a wall screen showing the biology of Vorkai sensory systems. She was explaining it the way she understood it, not the formal academic version, the living version. The way the eyes worked, the way the pheromonal response worked, the way the behavioral cascade triggered. She had drawn diagrams on the screen by hand, the way she drew in her sketchbook. The kids were completely absorbed, not afraid, curious. She'd managed to make them curious about it, about the thing that had come to hunt them. I stood in the doorway watching for a while. She looked up and saw me, the smile. I waved. She waved back and went back to teaching. I went and found Mara in her office. She'd taken on more formal responsibility by then, heading the Drift's expanded agricultural research program. She had 3 data slates on her desk, notes on 2 different wall screens, and the look of someone who was very busy and also completely in her element. She looked up. You're back. I'm back, I said. How was Vel-Tassin? I understood something, I said. She waited. Vreth Kalos told me what the hunting party leader said, about what he felt, before the categories. Mara was quiet for a moment, then slowly, before the categories. The original thing, I said. The thing that exists before prey and predator and fear and all the rest of it. She looked at one of her wall screens. It showed growth data from one of the drift's hydroponic bays, columns of numbers, charts of yield and light exposure and water use efficiency. The work of making things grow in a place where growing was hard. I think about that a lot, she said quietly. About what's underneath, before you learn what to be afraid of, before you learn what category to put things in. She paused. We're not built different. We don't have some special neurological feature that makes us less afraid. Sable isn't built different. She just retained something. Something that most of us process out by the time we're old enough to name it. Wonder, I said. Yeah, Mara said. Wonder, the first thing. The thing you have before you know what the world contains. She looked at me. That's what we should be. That's what the species is capable of being. Not stronger, not faster, not better weapons or better strategy. Just the thing that looks at an apex predator in a red-lit shelter and thinks, interesting. She paused. The question is whether we can remember how to do it.